The UN studio in Geneva buzzed with tension. World leaders from every continent had gathered beneath the harsh glare of global attention. Flags lined the walls, media cameras blinked red, and whispers floated across the massive hall like nervous winds. But it all went silent when Donald Trump, flanked by his entourage, leaned into the mic. He wasn't smiling. "This meeting is for serious leaders," Trump said coldly. "Captain Traoré, maybe you should leave the room." A hush swept over the crowd. Gasps. Heads turned. Some chuckled nervously, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. Ibrahim Traoré, in his crisp uniform, didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He slowly stood up. The camera zoomed in on his face. Journalists whispered, "Is he really leaving?" Trump sat back with folded arms, smug. But instead of heading toward the door, Traoré walked toward the microphone at the center podium. Calm, steady, silent. The world held its breath. And then he looked directly at Trump. Not with anger, but with something deeper. Something unshakable. Everyone expected rage, but no one expected what came next. Not even Trump. Captain Traoré adjusted the mic. His voice came low, steady, and sharp enough to slice through the air. "When truth becomes a threat to your power, it means your time is up." The room went silent, utterly silent. Trump's eyes narrowed. Reporters' jaws dropped. The interpreter paused, stunned. You could hear the soft click of a pen dropping in the far corner of the studio. Traoré said nothing else. He stepped back. The silence stretched. A single sentence. That was it. But it cut through lies, cut through pride, and cut into history like fire on dry paper. Phones buzzed. Journalists typed frantically. Twitter exploded. The African delegations leaned forward, faces full of restrained pride. CNN anchors scrambled. Did he just say that to Donald Trump? On live air? But Trump didn't say a word. Because how do you argue with truth? The world had seen many speeches at the UN, but never a moment like this. Not from an African leader. Not from a soldier. Not from a man the West thought would stay quiet. That's when it started. The viral explosion. But for Traoré, it wasn't about going viral. It was about finally being heard. As Captain Traoré walked back to his seat, flashes from cameras lit up the studio like lightning. But inside his heart, a storm far older than the cameras raged. What the world didn't know, not yet, was what this moment meant to him. It wasn't just about Trump. It was about every insult his country had swallowed silently. It was about every village ignored when aid was promised, but never came. Every mind stripped. Every African mother who lost a son in a war started by someone else's politics. Behind Traoré's steady face was the pain of generations. And as he sat down, his eyes didn't fill with pride. They filled, just barely, with unshed tears. Not of sadness, of relief. For the first time in his life, the world had heard him and couldn't unhear it. But not everyone was pleased. Behind the scenes, U.S. advisors whispered. Phones rang in European embassies. The wrong man had just spoken the truth too boldly. And they were scared, very scared. Because they had just seen something dangerous. A man who can't be bought. A soldier who speaks for the silenced. And he wasn't done yet. As the whispers died down, Ibrahim sat back quietly. He didn't need applause. He didn't want it. Because behind that calm voice was a man carrying pain the room couldn't see. They didn't know about the mother in Burkina Faso who buried her son after foreign airstrikes landed on mistaken targets. They didn't know about the farmer whose land was poisoned while global powers smiled for press photos. To many in the room, Traoré was just a young African officer in a uniform. But to his people, he was hope dressed in courage. He had watched too many leaders bow, He had seen his continent laughed at, exploited, used like a pawn in games it never agreed to play. And now, finally, he had said what others were too afraid to, not for attention, but because silence was becoming too painful to carry. In the media room, a young journalist from Ghana wiped her eyes. "I've waited my whole life to hear someone say that," she whispered. The video of his sentence crossed 7 million views in 1 hour, but behind the viral storm a darker wave was rising. Some powerful men wanted him silenced, and they were already making calls. The room might have gone quiet, but the corridors of power were suddenly loud. In a private security office near the UN chamber, 2 Western diplomats huddled near a phone. "Get someone on this," one said sharply. "He made us look weak. It's already trending in 20 countries. He embarrassed Trump on global air." They weren't just angry, they were afraid. Because Ibrahim Traoré's words weren't just going viral, they were awakening people. In villages, in schools, even in some Western cities. A new hashtag trended, "Shark Africa will speak." But in a quiet hallway, a UN staff member handed Ibrahim a folded paper. No signature, no name. One sentence. "You've gone too far. Go home before we make you." He looked at it, then looked up at the hall where world leaders were chatting and smiling like nothing had happened. He folded the note, slid it into his pocket, and walked toward the African delegation. His face didn't change. But inside, he knew the storm had begun. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was war over truth. And truth doesn't come cheap. Not when you say it on a stage they built. Later that evening, long after the cameras stopped flashing, Ibrahim stood by the large studio windows overlooking Geneva's night skyline. Alone. No press. No security. Just a soldier. And the world on his shoulders. He thought of his father, a school teacher who used to gather kids under a mango tree and teach them about honor, even when food was scarce. He thought of the orphans in Djibo, some still living under tarpaulin tents after European contractors abandoned their promise to rebuild. And he thought of the paper in his pocket, the warning. They wanted him scared. They wanted him to vanish quietly. But Ibrahim wasn't that kind of man. A cleaner passed by and stopped. "You're the man from the clip, right?" He nodded gently. "You made us proud," she whispered. Her eyes were glassy. "They've silenced us for too long." That moment, tiny, raw, real, reminded him why he spoke. Not for Twitter, not for fame, but for people who never get a mic. He looked out over the city once more, and he made a promise to himself. "Even if I walk alone, I will keep speaking." Tomorrow, the world would try to make him regret that. The next morning, while diplomats gathered again under glass ceilings and marble lights, something unexpected happened in West Africa. Thousands of people filled the streets of Ouagadougou, waving Burkina flags, holding handmade signs. "He spoke for us. Africa is not your puppet. Ibrahim, we see you." Mothers with babies on their backs, students, farmers, elders, some crying. They weren't protesting, they were thanking him. They had seen the clip, again and again. And even though it was only one sentence, it was a sentence they had waited generations to hear spoken in front of the world. But far from the joy, Ibrahim's personal phone lit up with a private call. His younger sister was in tears. She had just been visited, not by local authorities, but by foreign men in suits asking where he lived, where he stayed when in town. They didn't smile, and they didn't ask twice. Ibrahim's face hardened. This wasn't just about political insult anymore. They were trying to frighten his family. But if they thought this would make him silent, they forgot something. He was not raised to fear bullies. As the day continued, Ibrahim walked back into the studio. Not with bodyguards, not with handlers, just himself. The corridors were quieter than before. Some leaders avoided eye contact. Others gave fake smiles. Some nodded in quiet respect, but said nothing aloud. That's how truth works sometimes. It makes cowards uncomfortable. A UN staff member handed him the revised speaking agenda. He'd been removed from the official speaking list. No explanation, no apology. He looked down at his uniform. The same one he had worn when burying comrades in the Sahel. The same one soaked in sweat and dust after fighting off extremists with too little equipment and too few allies. And now, they wanted him quiet. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. So painfully, uncomfortably, undeniably right. He took a breath and turned to the cameras waiting in the lobby. I may not have a microphone inside that room, he said calmly, but the world gave me a bigger one. Your hearts, your eyes, your truth. And with that, he sat beside a stunned BBC reporter and prepared to speak. To the world. They tried to silence him, but the BBC didn't. And when the interviewer leaned in, asking Ibrahim what he wanted to say to the leaders who erased him from the agenda, he didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He whispered, if your power depends on silencing others, then you never had power, only fear. The room around them went quiet. Even the cameraman swallowed hard. But it was what he said next that changed everything. He looked straight into the lens, millions watching across the world, and said, this is not about me. It's about the child in Timbuktu who thinks he has no future, because the world told him Africa should stay poor. I am speaking for him. The anchor couldn't speak. She simply blinked back tears. Phones began to buzz again. From Dakar to Detroit, from Johannesburg to London, the interview was clipped, shared, reposted. Ibrahim Speaks trended globally. But behind the screen, not everyone was clapping. Some were watching with clenched jaws, and their silence was louder than applause because they were planning something Ibrahim couldn't yet see. That night, as the BBC clip went viral, Ibrahim sat alone in his hotel room. No advisors, no aides, just his thoughts, and a message waiting on his phone. From a West African president, one who had once smiled at him publicly, but remained silent when he was removed from the UN speakers list. The message was short. You made your point. Now let it go before things escalate. Ibrahim stared at the screen. His hands didn't shake, but his heart did. Not because of fear, but because he realized something painful. Even his fellow leaders had grown used to silence, used to tiptoeing, used to begging for aid instead of demanding respect. They didn't want him silenced because he was wrong. They wanted him silenced because he made them look small. He closed the message and stared out the window. Geneva's lights glittered like diamonds, but back home, villages were dark, still waiting, still hopeful. And he knew, if he gave in now, they would feel abandoned. He had no choice. Tomorrow he would speak again, not for politics, but for every child who never got a chance to dream. The next morning, just before stepping into another UN press briefing, Ibrahim received a sealed envelope. It had no return address. Inside was a photo. A young boy, barefoot, standing next to a blown-out well in rural Burkina Faso. Next to it, a handwritten letter. Dear Captain, my village watched you on a neighbor's TV. We cried when you spoke. My mother said you were the only leader who didn't lie. We have no water, no food, but we have your voice. Please don't stop speaking, please, from Yakuba, age 9. Ibrahim gripped the letter, and for the first time in a long time, he cried. Not loud, not messy, just quiet tears of a man carrying too much, yet still standing tall. He kept staring at Yakuba's eyes in the photo. The boy had never seen New York or Paris, but he had seen truth in a soldier's words, and that was all it took to believe again. Ibrahim folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked to the press mic where dozens of international journalists waited. But this time, he wasn't going to answer questions. This time, he had something to read. He stepped onto the platform, bright lights, flashing cameras, all eyes on him. Ibrahim held up the photo of Yakuba and cleared his throat. "This," he said softly, "is who I represent." Then he read the letter out loud, slowly, pausing between each line. Some reporters lowered their cameras. Some just stood frozen. One woman quietly removed her earpiece. She was crying, and when he finished, Ibrahim placed the letter down and said, "You want to talk about power? Power is when a child with no shoes makes a man with a microphone tremble." The room fell completely silent. Not because they didn't have questions, but because they suddenly remembered why they came into journalism in the first place: to tell the truth, to serve the people, to listen to the voiceless. But somehow, over the years, many forgot, and now a single man in military boots had reminded them, not with money, not with threats, but with the voice of a hungry boy. That night, Yakuba trended globally. In some places it was banned, but in others, it sparked something deeper than outrage. It sparked a movement. That evening, after his emotional press moment, Ibrahim returned to his hotel room. He needed rest. But instead he got a phone call. A trembling voice on the other end, his older brother, Musa. "Ibrahim," he whispered. "They came." "Who?" "Two men. They asked questions. They said they were UN security. But they weren't. I think they threatened Mama." Ibrahim sat up straight. His chest tightened. He had expected pushback. But not this. They had reached his mother. The same woman who raised 5 children by selling vegetables under a tree. The same woman who cried quietly the night he became captain. His eyes burned with fury, but his voice stayed low. "Don't leave the house. Stay with neighbors. I'll handle this." He hung up and stared at the city lights outside. In that moment, the mission changed. This was no longer just about justice on the global stage. This was about protecting his family. They had crossed a line, and now he would cross one too. But first, he had one more truth to speak. A truth the world would never forget. The next morning, a closed-door emergency session was held at the UN. Ibrahim wasn't invited. Trump was there. So were several presidents, diplomats, and industry executives. They discussed security disruptions and unauthorized influence from smaller nations. But what they really meant was him. One man against their comfort. One voice against their echo chamber. But in a small cafe just down the street, Ibrahim sat across from a young reporter from Kenya, who had smuggled him audio recordings from that secret meeting. "I thought you should hear what they really think," she whispered. "You changed my life." The recording played. Words like, "contain him," "block his agenda," and "he's igniting unnecessary hope in Africa" filled the air. Ibrahim didn't blink. He simply stared at his tea. Then he stood up. "Thank you," he said. "They just confirmed what I've always known." "What will you do?" she asked. He looked back at her with quiet fire. "I'll give the world one last sentence." That afternoon, while world leaders were giving carefully scripted speeches inside the studio, Ibrahim stepped outside, into the open courtyard of the UN building. Hundreds of people had gathered. Not presidents, not billionaires, just ordinary people. Students, mothers, Africans in the diaspora, even former UN staff, all waiting. For him. He didn't go to the official podium. He stood on a stone bench, held a small mic, and faced the cameras once more. He raised the letter from Yakuba in one hand and said, "If justice is illegal, then I proudly stand outside your laws." Gasps. Silence. Then, tears. One woman collapsed in emotion. A young man yelled, "We hear you, Captain." The moment hit like a wave. Live streams exploded. Even international news channels couldn't ignore it anymore. He wasn't inside the summit, but he had stolen the summit. One sentence, no insults, no shouting, just the truth and the weight of a continent behind it. And still, he wasn't done. Because something far more shocking was about to happen. Something that would test his heart, or break it. As Ibrahim returned to his hotel, a small child waited at the entrance. She held up a phone shakily. "Someone wants to talk to you." A video started to play. It was Yakuba, the boy who wrote the letter. This time he was sitting near a broken wall with about 40 children behind him, all barefoot, all staring at the screen. He spoke softly. "Captain Traoré, we saw you again. The village got electricity for 2 hours today. We used it to watch you and to pray for you." The camera panned. An elder man, missing teeth, stepped forward and said, "You are the first man who didn't forget us when the world told you to sit down. Don't stop." Ibrahim put his hand to his mouth. He tried not to cry, but his body shook. This wasn't politics anymore. This was a battle for dignity. A boy with no shoes had carried more truth than all the men in suits combined. And at that moment, Ibrahim made a decision. He would risk everything to make sure the world saw them. Not statistics, not aid projects, but souls. The summit was closing. Cameras turned toward the exit. Final statements were being delivered. But then, as if scripted by fate, Ibrahim walked in uninvited. No badge, no escort, just his uniform and his fire. Security moved. A few diplomats stood up. Trump himself turned sharply. "I thought I told you to leave," Trump said coldly. Ibrahim looked at him, calmly, deeply. Then, he stepped up to the central podium. No one stopped him. He pulled out Yakuba's letter and said, "If telling the truth costs me my seat, then I never belonged here in the first place." Gasps. He turned to the cameras and continued. "Africa is not a problem. Africa is your mirror. You just don't like what you see. But we will rise, not because you allow it, but because we remember who we are." Silence. Some cried, some clapped, some sat frozen, their pride shattered. But the internet, it exploded. We Remember trended in 80 countries, and suddenly the world was listening, not just to a soldier, but to a continent speaking through him. A week after the summit ended, the UN made a rare announcement. A new humanitarian task force was launched, led by African nations, funded independently, without conditions. And for the first time in years, small villages across Burkina Faso received medical aid, clean water trucks, and satellite learning tablets for children. Yakuba's village got power for more than 2 hours. The boy sent a final video. "Captain, I want to be like you." Ibrahim watched it from a quiet room, alone. But in his silence he smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of a man who didn't betray his soul. Back home, his mother stood in the market again, not to sell food, but because people just wanted to see her. To thank her, one woman said, for raising a lion. If you felt something, even the smallest tear, then this story wasn't fiction. It was truth. Like if Ibrahim's words touched your heart. Comment with the country you're watching from, and what made you cry the most. Subscribe if you believe truth, justice, and African voices deserve a place in the world. And remember, sometimes one sentence can shake the world.